So a quick review of literature, which really is just defined as written work on or text on a particular subject. So in other words, it's anything we read. And then prose and poetry as the two ways language is used in the literature we read. Now, prose and poetry have purpose, and we know that we can read something that's intended to persuade us, inform us, or entertain us. Poetry and prose can both do that. But what we do when we look at them compared to each other is we examine really how it sounds to us when we read it. Prose is writing like we would talk, whereas poetry is completely different and has a different sound to it. The idea with poetry is that it really is intended to be read aloud and to be experienced more than one time. Now, prose writing, again, is like we talk, and when we look at prose writing in fiction, when we read it, it sounds just like the language we use when we speak. We also can examine dialogue or the talk between characters in fictional prose. In nonfiction prose, often we will look at some of the features in text structures, and nonfiction prose might be set up with things like bold print and bullet points. But again, as we read it, it sounds like we talk. So then we have poetry, where the use of language is completely different. It can be fiction or nonfiction. Often fewer words are used to convey the meanings. Rhythm is easily detected when we read it aloud. And often when we just look at it, it does have a very different look from prose. Now, in your comprehension notebooks, you should have put this information about poetry to refer to. Poetry is very unique in that there are so many different ways poetry is organized and can be written. So we can read texts on the same topic. For example, all of these different texts are about snow. And as you examine these different texts, you can probably start to identify which texts are prose in the way the language is used, and which texts are intended to be poetry. So here's a collection of texts all on the topic of snow. All of these texts have to do with, you guessed it, worms. This collection has to do with bubbles. And the final, which is kind of my favorite because it's always a topic that makes us giggle, has to do with, yep, you got it, gas. So I invite you to select a collection and investigate the different ways that language is being used in poetry versus prose.